You know about Russia's devastating losses in the Ukraine war. You've heard stories about Russian soldiers refusing to fight. You're more than familiar with Russia's war crimes and crummy tactics. But you don't often hear Putin's POV and what he's telling his folks at home. Well, count your blessings, because we're about to make you privy to the proclamations and accusations of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. As you probably know, when all this kicked off in February 2022, when the conflict that started in 2014 turned into a full-scale war, Russia used different terminology from the rest of the world in regard to what was happening. As the Russian permanent representative to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, explained, "Don't call this a war. This is a special military operation." On February 24, 2022, Putin appeared on TV where he told his people,
Дорогие друзья, сегодня вновь считаю необходимым вернуться к трагическим событиям, происходящим на Донбассе.
Before we get to what Putin is saying now, even though he just said he wasn't in the mood to face any more boring questions, we should look at what he told Russians at the start regarding this so-called special operation. One thing that the show today is going to focus on is narratives. As a military analyst rightly said recently, the Ukraine conflict is about control of the narrative as much as it is armed conflict. Putin wants control, and his enemies want control. Control is essential to victory, which is why everything Putin says is a kind of weapon. We'll explain what we mean by this throughout the video. When the war got going, Putin talked about the tragic events of the Donbas, and that this invasion was for the security of Russia. He blamed irresponsible Western politicians for the war, who he blamed for overthrowing the elected pro-Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych. This was very important regarding Putin's narrative. He's always said this is a proxy conflict with the West, and certainly the USA, which he says is the chief string puller. This is why he felt happily vindicated when a leaked telephone call between U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, appeared on YouTube. In it, she indirectly talks about who should be the next leader of Ukraine, as if she was handpicking the person. It doesn't mean she actually practically picked him, although she obviously had her favorites. For instance, she said, "I don't think Klitsch should go into government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea." She was referring to the former heavyweight behemoth-turned-politician Vitaly Klitschko. She added, "I think Yats is the guy who's got economic experience, the governing experience. What he needs is Klitsch and Tyanibok on the outside." By Yats, she was referring to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who did become PM. Nuland got what she wanted, but as we said, that doesn't mean she had the power to put who she wanted into power. It's a colorful conversation in which she famously said, "Bleep the EU." Certainly made it look like the US was pulling the strings. After all, for many decades, the US has pulled strings worldwide and installed various leaders, sometimes taking down democratically voted-in politicians to replace them with tyrants. For Putin, Nuland had laid a golden egg right into his lap and inserted a feather in his cap. He used this as an example of U.S. interference in foreign affairs, backed by what he called a history of meddling. She was embarrassed and later said she wouldn't comment on what she called private diplomatic conversations. Still, today people debate what power the U.S. has had and currently has in Ukraine, with folks such as the economist and public proxy analyst Jeffrey Sachs and political scientist John Mearsheimer saying this is definitely a proxy war. This is a matter we're not going to comment on. It's a very complicated story, but we will say that Putin jumped on that phone call, a call that might have been leaked by Russia. A Russian newspaper gloated, "Madame Nuland doesn't only swear, she also gives detailed instructions on how 3 puppets from Kyiv's Maidan should act." The White House didn't deny the phone call was real, just saying that it was a new low in Russian tradecraft. It was indeed crafty if it were the Russians. As we said, we don't know how much power the US exerts over Ukrainian politics, but it has to be said that this call provided Putin with a lot of ammunition. He told Russian citizens repeatedly how the US was trying to destroy their country. The people believed him for the most part. Imagine if the boot was on the other foot and a top Russian politician had been caught talking about trying to install a new anti-American president, and then he got elected. The US press would have had a field day, and many people would have been at the very least suspicious. It's hard to blame the Russian people for not being suspicious of the US's intentions. Putin talked consistently about the expansion of NATO, an organization he said he'd been patiently trying to come to an agreement with for many years. He complained of cynical deception and lies coming out of NATO and what he called pressure and blackmail. This is what he said then, and it's what he says now. Nothing has changed in this regard. He has talked about the US and its allies and their arrogance in interfering with other countries' domestic and foreign affairs. He said the US feels absolute superiority among all nations, and Russia, he said, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was exploited when it was the most vulnerable. He says the arrogance of the US knows no limits and international law does not matter one bit to the country and its closest allies, especially when it comes to the Middle East, where Putin said the US conducted an illegal use of military power, creating what he called international terrorism and a humanitarian disaster in places such as Libya. This backs up his present narrative, which you already know he needs people to believe in. Please don't shoot the messenger, we're just telling you what he said. It doesn't mean he's right or wrong, we're just repeating the words. He was saying it as justification for the invasion, explaining that NATO's push eastward was another example of this exceptionalism. He said Russia was deceived and betrayed by NATO. For this to make a bit more sense, we should mention that for Putin, NATO is just a front for US foreign policy. He even went as far as to call the US and its allies a bunch of con artists, which you have to admit would be quite funny if circumstances weren't the opposite of funny. He called the US itself an empire of lies, although he admitted it was still a great country. Still, he said that if countries don't go along with what the US wants, they're going to feel the pain or the squeeze, as he likes to say. He said Russia was willing to talk it over with the US and its allies, but now the squeeze has been put on Russia, adding that the US wants to finish us off and utterly destroy us. Ironically, he talked about how the US wants to spread its values he called degenerate and counter to human nature, which, to anyone who knows the history of the Soviet Union, is some pretty hardcore hypocrisy. But this is what the Russian people heard, and many of them might have agreed with him, provided further by Putin going up in the popularity rankings. He was doing what any leader would do by inventing a good versus evil scenario, picking out bits of truth and embellishing them with exaggerations and subjective theories. He was fine-tuning this narrative. His main point is that Russia is innocent of all wrongdoing and is being bullied by the world's superpower. He issued a stark warning in this regard, that any potential aggressor will face defeat and ominous consequences. He was referring to nuclear weapons. After this, he clarified his statement by saying they would only be used if used against Russia, and he said NATO was not ever going to get away with expanding toward the east. Totally unacceptable, he said, not on his watch. For our country, it is a matter of life and death, he said. This is not an exaggeration, he added, it's a fact. So can you imagine what many Russians huddled as a family in front of their TVs were thinking at that point? He then told them that Russia's special military operation was for the people of the Donbas, who had pinned their hopes on Russia helping them after many had died at the hands of Ukrainian forces in what he called a genocide. He invoked the term neo-Nazis, whom he said had a stronghold in Ukraine. He even told his viewers that his right-wing enemies in Ukraine had gone as far as to aspire to acquire nuclear weapons, adding, "We will not let them do that." Of course, you know differently, you've heard a different story. You don't believe Ukraine is highly contaminated with neo-Nazis, although you do know the country has some issues with the far right wing in the past. You don't believe in Russia's innocence, as Putin describes it, but the fact is, this is what the Russian people have heard many times. It didn't help matters of transparency when in March Russia adopted what Reporters Without Borders said was a draconian press law, in which Putin said any news journalist found writing content that was false or mendacious in relation to the Ukraine situation could be sent to prison for 15 years. With that in mind, how can people in that country read stories that disagree with Putin and his rather handy explanation of things? After the law was introduced, the BBC, Bloomberg News, CNN, ABC, CBS News all stopped reporting in Russia or collecting news there. It was too dangerous for the journalists. Putin wanted to make his narrative unchangeable. As one critic said, "We are looking on helplessly as Russia's independent media are being silenced to death." Vladimir Putin has delivered the final blow and completed the destruction of Russia's independent media. The Russian government then went about blocking and banning all kinds of websites in Russia where people might get to read a more expansive tale of the tape regarding Ukraine. Russia even clamped down on a woman on Instagram that disagreed with Putin's narrative. She said she might now be looking at 6 years in prison. She wasn't being paranoid. A guy named Ilya Yashin was recently sentenced to 8 years for criticizing Putin on a YouTube live stream. The guy spoke the truth when he said after being sentenced, "With that hysterical sentence, the authorities want to scare us all, but it effectively shows their weakness." Whatever you think about the Western media, at least folks like Sachs and Mearsheimer haven't been blocked or banned, even if they have been criticized a lot. Admittedly, Sachs did get pulled off the air when he started talking about the Nord Stream explosion being a US operation. Still, it was easy enough to find that out. Anyone can hear what he has to say. In Russia, the people aren't so fortunate. Regular news sites rarely criticize their leader. They also released this statement: "Putin is a paranoid dictator. Putin must go. He started a senseless war and is leading Russia into a ditch. As far as we know, they haven't yet been fitted with a pair of cement shoes or had their organs vaporized after having a harmless-looking cup of tea, But when they wrote their critical articles, they added at the bottom, "Disclaimer, the material is not approved by the state, therefore the presidential administration will delete it. In other words, take a screenshot urgently before it's deleted." They were brave, considering the possible consequences. But there's another factor that has made Putin paranoid and thus more likely to lie to his people. Putin has been saying there are spies in his midst, writing lies at the bequest of the West. In September, that's what he said about a Russian journalist who was jailed for 22 years. After hearing there would be trouble if they said anything that contradicted Russia's defense ministry on Ukraine, other journalists had to flee the country. Putin wants his narrative encased in iron. If his foundation collapses, so does his leadership. At the end of the day, the power is always with the people. The Russian Defense Ministry at one point was saying there were no civilian casualties in Ukraine because Russian strikes had been so accurate. If photographs or videos showed differently, it was said because the Ukrainians had been bombing themselves. It sounded ridiculous, but with no independent media, that's the story everyone in Russia heard. The message is pretty clear. If you're not with him, you're against him, and against the fatherland. There's no middle ground or nuance to the narrative as there is elsewhere. In December, Putin said this about the people criticizing him: "The Russian people will always be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors and simply spit them out like a fly that accidentally flew in their mouths. I'm convinced that such a natural and necessary self-purification of society will only strengthen our country, our solidarity, cohesion, and readiness to respond to any challenges." We're not so sure a man who's been talking endlessly about the threat of Nazis chose wise words there. We all know which group in the 1930s and 40s likely talked about purifying society to strengthen it. Putin's assumption was wrong, as both St. Petersburg and Moscow saw widespread protests against his special operation, leading to the arrest of many peaceful protesters. It's these folks, he later said, that need purifying. This includes mothers of sons who've gone to Ukraine and not returned dressed in anything but a body bag. Putin has embraced the totalitarian spirit, but that's not how he explains it. He said his critics are diseased. They've contracted a virus from the West. They're infected with fake news. This is what tyrants learn in their college classes, Totalitarianism 101. We're kidding, of course. Tyrants learn their skills through experience. There's been more protests as the war has gone on. At the start, Putin talked in a way that made people think his special operation would be like a German blitzkrieg. It's been anything but. And now Putin is saying the war might be a long process. Anyone would think he's on the payroll of the world's arms industry because this war has already been expensive and it will have even more massive reverberations to economies and people living in them. This doesn't pain Putin, it doesn't vex Vladimir. Still, he said in December that he wouldn't be calling up more troops to serve. He told the Kremlin's Human Rights Council in these conditions to talk about some additional mobilization efforts makes no sense. There's no need for this for the state and for the defense ministry. This came right after some Ukrainian drone strikes that hit Russian turf. Putin had already ordered another 300,000 conscripts at that point. If the Ukraine war had been distant until then, it was now coming home. Putin hasn't changed at all, though, regarding the fundamental matters he talked about at the start of the war. As we said, he wouldn't speak at one point, reportedly saying he was sick of being asked to reply to the same old boring questions. He said what he has to say in this regard. He won't give up or change tack regarding what he sees as a US-led proxy war against his country. He even recently compared the West to the Nazis, although this kind of fury didn't mirror his foreign minister's words, who recently said that he had a certain hope that a compromise can be reached. It seems obvious that Putin hopes that both countries can reach a compromise, but it also seems obvious that if he doesn't get what he wants, the war will be a very long and bloody one. Recently, he talked again about existential threats and how Russia is fighting for its life. He said the struggle we are waging is a struggle for our sovereignty, for the future of our country and our children. It's almost exactly what he was saying in February when he took to the airwaves, but the Russian people watching him were perhaps feeling a bit less pessimistic about the whole affair than they do now. Late in 2022, Putin said that his military tactics fully justified themselves. He tried not to sound bothered about the failures and what's turned to a protracted war, but analysts are now saying he would feel better if he had an attractive off-ramp very soon. Things really haven't happened as he'd hoped. As one pro-Kremlin commentator recently said, the military operation is no question tougher going than had been expected. It was expected that 30 to 50% of the Ukrainian armed forces would switch over to Russia's side. No one is switching over. Putin also recently said that the West sanctions have really hurt his country, calling them an economic blitzkrieg. He admitted there have been deep structural changes to our economy and it is hurting the masses. Still, what he thinks about the West hasn't changed. In that same speech, he claimed yet again regarding the US, there's only one goal, the destruction of Russia. He also said that the West's power over global communications is a weapon just as useful as an explosive. The West, he said, will mount a propaganda campaign so cunning that his own people will turn against him. As far as an information war is concerned, the US holds most of the cards, since it controls most of the tech. Putin knows that there's not much he can do about this weakness. He explained not long ago, an unprecedented information campaign has been unleashed, which involves global social networks and all Western media, the objectivity and independence of which turned out to be just a myth. Still, Putin also likely knows that independent journalists, some of whom have won Pulitzers and done some impressive investigative work in the past, are being called Putin apologists for having another take on the grand narrative of the war. Putin must be able to recognize that their voices are not banned or sequestered. They have channels on YouTube, pages on Substack, and accounts on the newly transparent, maybe Twitter. There will be transparency, which is more than you can say for Putin's Russia. He's being a total hypocrite too, considering he's acting like the information czar of Russia, a real-life big brother. He reminds us of George Orwell's book 1984, which explains, doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. He condemns misinformation and then spreads it, but arguably every country has done that in the past. After all, if you control the past, you control the future. If you control the present, you control the past. That's not us, that's Orwell again. The people of the West are at least free to read and watch what they want, and they can make up their own minds about what's going on in Ukraine, who's behind it, and if Mr. Putin is a tyrant, or if he's just fighting back against a dastardly imperial America. Maybe the story is not so simple, and like most important historical tales, it's full of gray areas worthy of lengthy, polite, intelligent discussion. With that in mind, calling anyone who disagrees with him scum and a traitor is very harsh and plainly not true. He should know that in this day and age, suppressing information often works against you because at some point it comes out, and then no one trusts you. If Putin's theory is real, that the US-led West is trying to kill off Russia, then surely people will see that for themselves if they have access to enough data. If Russia is under threat and is being hard done to, they'll see that too. Putin said lately that he has no regrets about the invasion and still believes Russia is acting correctly and in a timely manner. Not too many analysts think he actually will use nuclear weapons and bring about mutually assured destruction. At a December meeting, he said, "We've not gone mad. We're aware of what nuclear weapons are. We aren't about to run around the world brandishing this weapon like a razor." He reminded everyone present that Russia does not have nuclear weapons in other countries' backyards. He said that's the policy of the US. He also reminded the attendees that the US had mulled over preemptive military strikes and that the US was not shy to openly talk about it during the past years. White House analysts called this mere saber-rattling. Let's hope so. Some analysts say he'll concentrate more on cyber warfare from now on. Controlling narratives and hacking infrastructure can be just as helpful in war these days as conventional weapons, but let us hope for constructive dialogue with a happy ending and transparency among nations, since the truth we've heard sets you free. The suppression of it, as Orwell said, might look like a boot stamping on a human face forever. Now you need to watch Insane Ways Vladimir Putin Survived Assassination Attempts, or have a look at why Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a failure.